there's always a temptation for us to fit in with the world and to be accepted by the world. And the world, for better or for worse, the world of academia, the world of governments, the world of business, they reject the idea that there's a spiritual world. Today, if you start talking about demons, the world will laugh at you and say you're a fool. And I think for that reason, a lot of Catholics are afraid to talk about the demonic. They're afraid to talk about this stuff because it seems medieval, it seems superstitious. But really, it's right there in the Gospels. I mean, Jesus is an exorcist. He drives out so many demons. They are real. That's part of the Christian message. But a lot of Catholics, a lot of Christians in general, are afraid to talk about it because it can make us seem like loonies to the world.
Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, bless his holy name.
Hi, thanks for tuning in to Armor of God again. And as always, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us. And hopefully all of you will learn so much from this video. And also, this is going to be another video of my interview with Father Deacon Anthony on the Eastern Catholic tradition. And this time, I'd like to share here his many answers on questions related to spiritual warfare. And of course, he'll answer them through the lens of Eastern Catholic tradition. Before that, I'd like to share this very short clip that a friend shared with me on Twitter.
Invocamos a los nahuales, a las deidades y a los demás seres y espíritu divino que habita este lugar. Pedimos vida, iluminación y sabiduría para la presidenta constitucional, doctora Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo.
Well, now coming back to this video, let me share this one, where I asked Father Deacon Anthony, how do the Eastern Catholic churches view exorcisms?
Exorcism is very much a part of the tradition of the church, both West and East. We always, do an exorcism before every baptism. That's standard procedure for us. But as far as an exorcism goes, where, the priest is facing down the demon, trying to drive the demon out, we tend to handle it a little bit differently in the sense that, so I need to back up a bit. In the Eastern Catholic tradition, and in the Eastern Orthodox tradition as well, we tend to believe that celibacy is best paired with community. So we have monks who are celibate, and they live together in groups, and they support each other. Most of our diocesan priests are actually married men with families. Married priests is a normal part of the Eastern Christian tradition. There's nothing, radical about it. It's how we've done things for 2,000 years. So most of our diocesan priests are married. Not all, but most are. Most of the celibate priests are actually monks. And in our tradition, we tend to really value monasticism a lot. And the monks are the ones who are seen as most clearly following the example of Christ, more so than priests. Monks are given that role in a sense, and how we look at them. So in our tradition, the exorcist typically would not be a parish priest. The exorcist would be a monk. And there are a few reasons for that. The monastic tradition is very much linked with the prayers of exorcism. I mean, most of them were written by monks, and there's a whole connection there. But also, in our tradition, it could be dangerous for a married man to engage in exorcism because there's a spiritual bond between the priest and his wife and the children. And when you become an exorcist, you become a target. And the wife and the kids would become a target as well. So in our tradition, the monks primarily are the exorcists more than the diocesan priests.
And while I was resting and just watching some random stuff, I came across this video of a Japanese man who's living and somewhat in love with a doll, like literally in love with a doll. I just think that it's sad, and just because a country is modern and so advanced in terms of technology, this somewhat shows how much the Japanese society is somehow forgetting the basic human needs. Of course, this is just my opinion, and I can be wrong, and I'm not afraid to admit it if I'm wrong, but would be interested to know what you think about this. Anyway, coming back to this video now, and I also asked his opinion on spiritual warfare through the lens of Eastern Catholic tradition.
very often when people think of spiritual warfare, they think of exorcisms. They think of, the priests battling the demons. That happens, but that's a very rare occurrence. Those are the exceptions, definitely not the rule. In the Eastern Christian tradition, we often talk about spiritual warfare taking place primarily in the mind. That's where most of it is, the mind. So we all have influences around us. Wherever we go, things influence us. They put thoughts in our minds. Things like advertisements, talking to other people, the internet. You go on the internet and there are ads everywhere. Go on your phone, there are ads everywhere. Put on the radio, there are ads. I mean, there are things all around us influencing us, giving us ideas. But we also believe that sometimes spiritual forces can put ideas in our mind as well. Not every thought we have comes from inside of us or even from the world around us. But the Eastern tradition is that sometimes spiritual entities who mean us harm can also put thoughts in our mind. And the most basic spiritual warfare is learning how to resist those thoughts and not let them take root and grow. Because if they take root and grow, oftentimes they get powerful, and they can get so powerful that if we act on them again and again and again, it becomes harder and harder for us to resist those thoughts. And in time, it can become what's called a passion. Uh, in this context, the word passion is a behavior that controls you. You basically become a slave to the passion. So if a passion overtakes you, you're not able to resist it. I think a modern term for this would be addiction. Certain behaviors become addictive, and they're very hard for us to resist. But we believe that these thoughts, sometimes they come from within, sometimes they come from regular worldly things, but they can also come from demonic entities who want us to be slaves to passion. It says in the book of Genesis that human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. The Christian tradition is that the image of God in humanity is our free will, our ability to make choices. That's the image of God in us. Well, the demonic entities, they want to snuff out the image of God. They want to get rid of the free will. What separates us from animals is that we can make choices, reasonable choices. Animals can't. They're pure instinct. But if you become a slave to the passions, you're almost like an animal in the sense that it's harder and harder for you to make choices. Your free will is being dramatically impaired. And that's what the demons want. They want to reduce us to the level of animal. So in the Eastern Christian tradition, we really emphasize that the primary battleground of spiritual warfare is in our minds.
Previously, I shared a clip of Father Joseph Iannuzzi explaining about the Desert Fathers' battle against the devil in the desert. And so I also asked Father Deacon Anthony about the Desert Fathers and their role in the spiritual battles.
I think that's part of it. I think part of it was escaping from society and society's corruption as well. So the Desert Fathers, most of them went out right after Christianity was legalized by the Roman Empire. And part of the reason for that was when Christianity was legalized, a lot of people flooded into the church, not necessarily for the right reasons. It became almost like a trend or a fad. And Christianity in some places became really watered down. So the Desert Fathers were kind of rejecting that. They were rejecting society. They're rejecting how the church was being compromised in some places. But for many of them, it also was about spiritual warfare. And in the ancient world, the desert was seen as the place where spirits dwelt. That's where the demons were, in the desert. So if you went into the desert, you were expected to find supernatural things happening. And later on, when Christianity spread to Europe, the forest kind of took the place of the desert. You'd have people go into the forest to establish monasteries or to live as hermits because the forest was the magical place with the spiritual dangers. But yes, I mean, initially, one of the reasons they went out there was for spiritual warfare because, the desert was an arena. The monastery was an arena where you're battling against spiritual forces. And very often the spiritual forces would attack very directly. Like I said, when you live in a culture like ours, the devil has all kinds of ways of attacking you. He can get to you through the media, through other people. But when you're in the desert and there aren't many other people around and there's no media, there's no culture, sometimes the demons come at you very directly. They don't even bother hiding what they are. They just come at you, in demonic form, according to the tradition. And I think a lot of them were prepared for that. And yeah, that was one of the reasons they went out there, to undergo the spiritual battle.
And I also asked his opinion on the rising interest in the New Age, the occult, witchcraft, etc.
The Satanic Temple leading the fight to keep abortion legal, that actually makes a lot of sense. That seems very appropriate, doesn't it? Because one could argue that abortion has become almost like a sacrifice, like to Molech back in the Old Testament, the way it's used for convenience, in most cases at least. But I think people are hungry for some sort of spiritual connection. If you believe that all that exists is what we can see, feel, and touch, and that life ends with death, there's nothing else out there, um, that's a pretty sad existence. And I think people want to believe that there's more out there. There's more than what we can see, feel, and touch. They have a longing for this. And part of it is we're made to worship God. There's something inside of us where we want to worship God. Um, but if you've been conditioned not to believe in God, well, that longing for a spiritual connection is still there. So oftentimes it gets misdirected into other things. And I think for some people, they're drawn towards the supernatural, because for them, it gives some sort of comfort and sense that there's more to the world than what we can see, that there perhaps is life after death. So you find a lot of interest in things like ghost hunting. That's really popular. The New Age, the occult, spiritualism. These are all things that people gravitate towards because there's a longing in them. There's a longing in them for something greater than us, to believe that there's more to the world than what we can see. And I think oftentimes that's where it's directed.
And then I told him that maybe the church isn't doing enough to talk about the spiritual battle. Apart from the exorcist, there's hardly any mention of the real enemy of the church, which is the devil.
Yeah, I mean, my personal opinion is that the church doesn't talk enough about the supernatural. And I think just getting it out there, talking about it more is a big step. Um, as far as educating people, well, that could be done through homilies and whatnot. I know the local Roman Catholic parish in my town, they brought in a wonderful exorcist, um, Father Lambert. Um, I think he was on your channel once, wasn't he? They brought him in and he gave a 2-day mission where he explained a lot of stuff. He brought it all back to Jesus. It all went back to Christ. But the fact that he was talking about the supernatural and talking about demons actually brought in a big crowd. And people were there for the stories, but ultimately he brought it all back to faith in Jesus. And I think things like that is very helpful. And I'd love to see more of that.
And we know that temptation is the #1 attack used by the demons to lead us to sin and to lead us away from God. So I thought I asked his advice in regards to handling these temptations.
So, in the Eastern Christian tradition, we talk a lot about being vigilant over the mind. We have to exercise vigilance. So, when a thought comes into our mind, we have to be careful what we do with it. There's a tendency that when thoughts come in, just kind of play with them, to let the imagination run with them. We have to realize that sometimes thoughts that come into our mind are not good. Sometimes they come from evil forces. And what we have to do is surrender them to God. If a tempting thought comes into your mind, you need to surrender it. Don't try and fight it, because if you fight it, the more attention you give it, the harder it is to resist. What I always recommend is just surrendering it to God. Just say, God, I give this thought over to you, and then praying. Calling upon the name of Jesus is very powerful. In the Eastern churches, we have a tradition called the Jesus Prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And saying that has a lot of spiritual power. Calls upon the name of Jesus, and in my experience, it drives away evil. So the first thing I want people to recognize is that you can't allow your thoughts to run with temptations. You have to have vigilance, watchfulness. Now, the other thing I think people need to realize is that we are not our thoughts. And this is important because a lot of people will have a thought come into their mind, and the thought may be put there from the world and may be put there by a demonic entity. But because we have that thought, we think that thought is who we are. For some people, those thoughts become their identities. So different people have different temptations. And let's say a person has a thought put in their mind, maybe of a sexual nature, maybe a thought of a sexual nature that's out of the norm in society. Well, rather than rejecting that thought, people are told that that thought is who they really are. It's their true self, and they need to embrace that thought and live that thought. So rather than rejecting temptations, people are making the temptations they face their identity. And that's a big problem. You can't allow it to go that far.
And we've listened to Father Daniel Rehill many times before, commenting on the type of movies and the cultures that are being spread by Hollywood out there. So I asked him if there's any advice he can share with young parents out there and raising children in this day and age.
Unfortunately, the media has become a bastion of all kinds of temptations, worse than ever. Um, we made the decision as a family. I'm married and I have two children. We made the decision as a family a number of years ago to get rid of cable television because the stuff that was coming through it, a lot of it wasn't very positive. I mean, there are wonderful things like EWTN, but for every EWTN, there are 100 other stations that are corrupting and corrupting children. And I saw it getting worse and worse, even in children's cartoons. All kinds of sexual stuff and gender identity stuff was being forced into cartoons for little kids. And I saw it with my own eyes. And I turned off those programs when we got rid of the cable because of that. So I think we have to be careful because our culture is toxic, perhaps more toxic than it's ever been. And trying to raise a child in this culture can be very, very difficult. What I would say is monitor what they watch, try and limit their exposure to anything that could corrupt them. But at the same time, you have to make certain that faith is at the center of the family. And that's one of the most important things. Pray together as a family, pray with the children, talk to them about God, talk to them about Jesus, but also show that going to church is a priority for your family. Because here in the United States, a lot of people just don't bother going to church. And what's happened is, like where I live, a lot of athletic events now take place on Sunday mornings. There'll be sporting events, soccer games for little kids on Sunday mornings. So people miss church because they go to those events. My oldest daughter for a while was a cheerleader, and she really enjoyed it. But then they started having more and more games on Sunday mornings or early Sunday afternoons that were interfering with church. And at a certain point, we decided church is way more important than being a cheerleader at a football game. And I think making that a priority, showing that going to church always takes precedence over everything else, is an important lesson that children do remember.
And finally, I also asked his opinion on Halloween, and he even commented a little bit about Harry Potter as well.
So I think as long as it's kept in proportion, I don't see Halloween as being inherently problematic. For most people, it's just a fun occasion for kids to put on a costume, walk around, collect candy. If it's treated that way, I think it's perfectly fine. Now, there are some people out there who do take it with a more intense occult approach. Of course, that's definitely not good. But I think in general, I don't see a problem with people going along with the festivities as far as it involves things like, costumes and collecting candy. I think it's mostly harmless. I also don't really think Harry Potter is necessarily problematic. And I'll tell you why. I remember when Harry Potter first came out, a lot of Christians were like calling it demonic and denouncing it. There was actually a large Protestant megachurch not too far from where I was living, where they had a book burning, where they brought in all these Harry Potter books and burned them. It kind of looked like Nazi Germany, actually. It was not a good thing. But there was all this condemnation against Harry Potter because of the occult and the supernatural. But I tend to think that as long as the person reading it understands that it's fantasy, it's okay. And I think it's important that if a child is reading it, that they understand that it's not real and that they know the Bible better than they know Harry Potter. I think that's important. They should know our faith first and foremost. And if they're grounded in the faith and they understand that Harry Potter is fantasy, I don't see it as problematic. Interestingly enough, all these Christians were so opposed to Harry Potter and burning it, 20 years ago. Today, the people burning Harry Potter books are radical leftists. They see J.K. Rowling as enemy number one because she has been surprisingly one of the strongest, bravest voices for sanity. She speaks out against horrific evil that's being done to children. A lot of people are afraid to say anything, but she is fearless and brave. God bless her. If anything, I would celebrate her. We have to understand that, magic has always been a part of literature and stories going back thousands of years. As long as people understand that the magic in Harry Potter is not the real thing, I think it's fine. The danger is if somebody is not grounded in their faith, they read Harry Potter and they start thinking that this kind of thing could be real, and they go out and start actually reading about actual magic and actual witchcraft. I think that could be very problematic. So I tend to think that Harry Potter is fine for people who are grounded in reality and grounded in their faith.
Well then, that will be all for the video this time. And as always, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us. And if there's any feedback or suggestion, please don't hesitate to let us know in the comments below. Anyway, if you like what we do and you'd like to support us, I left a link to our PayPal donation in the description box below, and from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for your continuous support, contributions, and prayers. And until the next one, thanks again for watching, and may God bless you.
Any father can bless his children. And I think that's an important thing. I do bless my children fairly regularly, just pray over them and bless them. But also, I think it's important that as a family, you talk about faith. And I think it's important that you pray as a family. And it's important too that you have a place or a way of focusing on prayer in your home. In the Eastern tradition, we often have what are called icon corners. We have a corner in the house where we have icons, maybe some incense, candles, but it's a focal point where we can look at those icons and we can meditate and we can pray. I think it's important to have things throughout the house that convey a spiritual message, that draw people's minds towards God. So, having religious artwork around, statues, icons, that kind of thing makes a difference because it's a constant reminder of what we value.